Well, good afternoon. My talk this afternoon is on working youth on farms in the U.S. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Kitty Hendricks, who put this presentation together. We're both with the Division of Safety Research, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health out of Morgantown, West Virginia. First, I'd like to go over the data sources that were used in this presentation. The Childhood Agriculture Injury Survey, or CASE, is conducted by NIOSH through an interagency agreement with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It is a telephone survey of 50,000 farm operations, and it provides national estimates on demographic and non-fatal injury data on farms. The current population survey is jointly conducted by the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a monthly survey of about 50,000 households, and for this presentation, it's used for employment data for youth age 15 to 17 years of age and as denominator data for rate calculations. And then we have the Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries, or CFOI. It's conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it is a multiple source database used to identify, document, and verify work-related fatalities. There were 2.17 million farms in the U.S. in 2012. 3/4 of these farms reported having youth less than 20 years of age on their farm at some point during the year. 60% of the farms reported youth relatives on them, with 14% of these relatives having performed unpaid work activities. Over 1/3 of the farms had other youth visitors. These could be friends of the family youth that live on the farm, or it could have been farm tours that came to the farm, for examples. 22% of the farms had youth that lived on the farm, or what we call household youth, and about 6% of the farms reported directly hiring youth. This translates into about 117,300 farms that directly hired youth. 18% of the farms required youth to have some sort of training prior to hiring. This could be the tractor machinery certification training, some other sort of specialized equipment training, or livestock handling procedures, just as some examples. 49% of the farms indicated that they provided training to the new hires, but conversely, that means that over half, or 51%, did not. To answer the question, how many youth work in agriculture, we'll go to two data sources. The 2012 Current Population Survey estimates that 50,000 youth aged 15 to 17 were employed in agricultural production for 2012. The 2012 Childhood Agricultural Injury Survey estimated 731,000 youth less than 20 years of age worked on farms in the U.S. Almost 2/3 of these were youth that lived on the farm, or household youth. Over 1/3 were youth that were directly hired by the farm operator, and over 70% of these working youth were less than 18 years of age. Looking at some trends for working youth on farms from 2001 to 2012, we see there has been a decrease in both the household and the hired working youth for this time period. If we look at working youth by gender, we see that over this time period of 2001 to 2012, males have decreased by 38% and females have decreased by 10%. Now we'll look at some non-fatal injuries to youth that work on farms. In 2012, there are 14,000 injuries to youth less than 20 years of age. 20% of these injuries were work-related. 82% occurred to males. It was about equally divided between livestock and crop farms, and the majority of these non-fatal injuries occurred in the Midwest region. For 2012, these non-fatal injuries, almost half of those occurred to the household youth, slightly less than 1/3 occurring to hired youth, and 20% to these other youth that we had talked about earlier. Some characteristics of these non-fatal injuries: over 2/3 of the injuries occurred while a supervisor was in the immediate area. 62% of the injuries occurred while completing a task that the youth had a year or greater experience in doing. 42% of the injuries resulted in a cut or laceration. 1/3 of the injuries occurred to the upper extremities, which would include the hands, arms, wrists, and fingers. And 30% of the injuries occurred in the barn area. We look at some trends of non-fatal injuries to the youth that work on farms from 2001 to 2012. We see overall there is a reduction of 72%. For household youth, there is an 80% reduction in the number of injuries, and for hired youth, there is a 56% reduction. For the non-fatal injury rates for this same time period for the working youth, we see there is a total reduction of 60%. For household youth, there is a reduction of 70%, and for hired youth, there was a reduction of 28%. And it might be interesting to note that in 2012, this was the first time that we'd seen the non-fatal injury rates for hired youth be higher than it was for the household youth. If we look at these non-fatal injury rates by gender, we see for this 2001 to 2012 time period that females, the non-fatal injury rates were reduced by 75%, and for males, 50%. Now we'll look at fatal occupational injuries to youth. This chart shows occupational fatalities to youth less than 18 years of age for the decade 2003 to 2012. We can see agricultural production has almost half of all the injuries for this decade. And if we look at the current population survey, we find out that the 15 to 17-year-olds only account for slightly less than 4% of the population. So we can see that this ag production sector definitely has a disproportionate share of the fatalities. For this decade, there were 162 work-related fatalities. 91% of those occurred to males, and 72% occurred in crop production. We look at some trend lines for fatalities to these youths. For the number of fatalities, we see a pretty erratic trend line here, but it does average about 16 deaths per year. And while one could probably make the case that there appears to be a slight decline, it was not statistically significant. If we look at fatalities by youth working on farms by age groups, we see a linear progression with the number of fatalities as the ages go up to where we end up with the 16 and 17-year-olds having the greatest number of fatalities. And looking at the fatalities by regions across the U.S., we see that the Midwest leads with the total number of fatalities, followed by the West, the South, and the Northeast. Looking at the fatalities by injury source, we see tractors continue to be the leading source of fatalities for youth that work on farm, followed by ATVs, vehicles, and machinery. And for injury events, we see the transportation events, both non-highway and highway, are their leading events, followed by equipment and vehicles. And it might be interesting to note that this caught in collapsing material, which accounts for over 10% of the fatalities, typically involves grain events. The fatality rates for youth 15 to 17 years of age at work on the U.S. farms, again, is a fairly erratic line, and there could be an argument made, except for 2010, it looks like there is kind of somewhat of a general decrease, but it was not statistically significant. So to summarize then, between 2001 and 2012, non-fatal injuries to working youth on farms have decreased by over 70%. There has not been a similar decline for the fatal occupational injuries in agriculture, and in fact, you could argue that the agricultural production has a disproportionate share of the fatalities. The Midwest had the most injuries, both non-fatal and fatal, and fatality rates for youth working at farms has shown a general decline, but were not statistically significant. That would conclude. Thank you.